All right, my name's Alfonso. I'm a mobile app developer here at S2. I'm going to talk about my experience working on an app I'm currently working on with React Native. The app itself isn't actually an S2 project, but my first experience with React Native was actually from an S2 initiative. So here at S2, when you're not actively working on a client project, you have the opportunity to work on like internal experiments. And some end up seeing the light of day and get published to the App Store or wherever. Others are just pretty much for upskill. Chris Marotta, he rendered this incredible scene as the hero image. We have like the Android robot guy on the left, and then a swift bird on the right to represent iOS, and then this original character we came up with to represent React Native a little bit. He's like a confident underdog who thinks he can step in the ring with the heavyweights just because he has a lot of support behind him, you know. Big, fervent, open source community, as well as the big guns like Facebook, Airbnb. So let's get to it. First off, just a little bit about me. I've been developing Android apps in a professional capacity for 6 years, and iOS development for about 5, though I've been messing around with my own apps in my spare time for longer than that. Here are some apps I've made that I can actually share and talk about. I actually made the original Avis car rental app for Android in a different life. It does not look like that now, I hope. After that, I made a bunch of mobile ticketing apps for a lot of transit agencies in the country. So like you buy your ticket through the app, and then you get a barcode that you scan once you get on the train or bus or whatever. And then I also made a MMORPG in my own time that's impossible for one person to maintain, but I did it anyway. But I got to learn the Cocos game development environment and got to try out making some anime characters. It's not the best artwork in the world, but I think we can all agree it's the top 3. And in terms of iOS and Android development in general, here are some things that I like that are relevant to the themes of this talk. So the functional languageness of Swift, which is a word. You can map and filter over collections, and you have closures, which are a lot like your lambdas. I like how UI is described with XML in Android. Something about doing it in XML separate from the Java just makes it feel more decoupled from the view and the presenter. I like learning about new things. Right now, I'm refactoring some code for a client to turn it from model view presenter to model view view model. That's actually been a super interesting experience. And in general, I try to have a healthy amount of base classes and generics, just so I'm not repeating myself. So things I don't like, repeating myself. Thought I'd drive that point home. Slow compilation and loading times. Some of the dependency injection frameworks in Android rely on a lot of compile time building and auto-generating classes, and it results in a very long compilation process. Sometimes, like this morning, it took me 4 minutes to clean and compile an Android Wear smartwatch app, which you can imagine, it's like the smallest possible app you can make, but it still took 4 minutes, and then I hated everything. Bug fixing and maintenance work, the least enjoyable part of the job, I think, for me. I prefer creating new things that passably work as opposed to patching it up so that it actually works. I don't know. I get bored easily, and poorly formatted code. Another part of the job is reviewing your colleagues' code and going through articles and tutorials and reading through example code, and then when elements aren't spaced sufficiently or consistently, it just makes something that's already not enjoyable even less enjoyable, and then I hate everything. But anyway, so I wanted to make an app just in my own spare time. Now, I don't know if any of you use Instagram or have had it for more than a year or so, but Instagram, they used to have this mapping feature in there where you could view your geotagged maps, geotagged photos on a map. But at some point earlier this year, they took that functionality away. This is what it used to look like. So evidently, the vast majority of Instagram users, they don't actually travel or anything. So when they pull up that map, it's just like this giant blob of 500 pictures in the one little town that they live in. And that feature is just totally useless for them. And it's actually a hassle to try to visualize their photos in that sort of medium. But for people like me who do like to travel, I like to go back and look at places I've been to and see the kinds of inappropriate pictures I took there. I really miss that feature. And I decided that I would just make my own app doing that, plus a little bit more. So if I can just pull a Tarantino a little bit and move the time to present day, this is what I currently have. And originally, these are the features that I had wanted in the app. So number one, view Instagram media on the map. Number B, filter media by time range. And unordered bullet points, organize media into different albums. So that's the kind of app I wanted to make and sought out to make. So now let's go back and learn a little bit about the high-level steps I took to get here. So why did I choose to go with React Native instead of making an iOS app and then doing the same exact thing twice in making the Android app? It's because I didn't want to make an iOS app and then do the same exact thing twice by making the same Android app. Now, I've had conversations with other mobile devs and stuff about React Native, and they're usually super averse to doing the one code base to multiple platforms thing. They're usually die-hard about the one platform they develop for, and of course they're absolutely right that you'll never get a React Native app that feels as nice or performs as well as a native app. But they're also usually just an iOS developer or just an Android developer, and they've never gone through the pain and suffering of making two versions of the same app with pretty much identical business logic and user experience flow and UI elements. And I've had to do that for years. But stuff like PhoneGap and HTML5, it always looked unconvincing to me, so I never messed with those solutions. But through my experience with the internal React Native experiment here, I knew that the app I wanted to create didn't need to be super high performant. The user flow, the UX experience was fairly simple and straightforward. And I knew that I wanted to write another blog post, and I knew that I wanted to give a talk at a future React meetup. So it just felt like the time was right for React Native. So, okay, now back further in time to the internal React Native experiment. Luckily, I had already worked on web stuff before, so I was already familiar with NPM, even basic JavaScript syntax, CSS and such. So I wasn't totally lost in the beginning, but it had been a long break in developer years since I touched that stuff, so there were definitely times early on when I struggled with even relatively basic things. Like, I specifically remember getting lost when I tried importing some module or component that I wrote into a file, but React would complain that it was unable to find the component or function that I needed, which is impossible because I'm looking right at it and it's spelled correctly and everything, so obviously React is stupid. But upon closer inspection of like other examples of code that I studied in GitHub repos, I saw that some imports have curly braces and some imports don't. And not a single getting started tutorial mentioned anything about this, so after spending entirely too much time getting stuck on imports, a quick Google search revealed that you don't need braces for a function that was declared as the default, but you do need braces if it's any other one. Really minor stuff like this I kept getting stuck with, which made me question my existence. Now, for the next thing that I spent entirely too much time on, project structure and naming conventions. Every single example GitHub repo I studied, they all had different ways of organizing their files and folders, and even like naming their files and the sentence case and everything. And I'm like super serial about this stuff. So I went looking for some official one best practice source of truth, and I found nothing. Just a bunch of Medium posts about the merits of one way versus the other. And I'm almost certain if we opened up the floor right now to for everyone to exalt their React project structure, we'd get a live reenactment of a Slack overflow argument. But for whatever reason, I ended up with this structure. Like each component gets its own index in styles.js and sources.js that's all lowercase, but the file underneath it is camel case for some reason. I don't remember why I did it that way. But I spent way too much time on this in the beginning, and revisiting it now just sucks as much. So let's move on. On a happy note, I found working with the UI definitions of React to be simple and straightforward. React Native uses JSX to describe how UI elements should behave and be layered and rendered. And it works a lot in the same way as how Android does it with XML. So that was really nice. And both of these, any offering that iOS has ever done, whether it's the interface builder or even like an auto layout upgrade like SnapKit. Because designing for web and Android, from the beginning, they knew that they were going to have different screen sizes and ratios. So the problem of laying out for all those things had been a focus since the beginning. But iOS, it was originally like the mindset had been, okay, we have this one device and it's always going to have this screen size. So interface builder is just going to work this way forever and that's it. But that did not end up being the case at all. So moving on to the IDE. Okay, I did all the required reading and I spent time on React Native with the internal experiment. Now during the time between starting the internal experiment and starting my Instagram app, there had been some developments on the IDE front for React Native. Deco IDE was starting to be a thing, but at the time it still looked very, very prototypey, so I decided to just stick with what I knew and went with Nuclide, the Nuclide package, on top of Atom to get React Native support. You're able to start and stop the packager from within the IDE, but as far as the built-in tools, that's really all I knew how to get working. Apparently there's also a debugger in there, and you're supposed to be able to launch your Android emulator from a button somewhere. But I never got any of these built-in tools working. So I always had a command line prompt open to get building and launching and all that. So prior to working with React Native, I always complained about the shortcomings of Xcode and Android Studio and how they're slow and buggy and always crashing. It wasn't until this experience with React Native that I realized I'd been taking those guys for granted all these years. Because when you're doing React Native development, having a native IDE built specifically for that platform gets you a lot of bonuses that make things easier for development. So I imagine most of you are probably doing web development every day. So whatever workflow environment you've set up for yourself, you've probably got plugins or some sort of solution so that you can have all this stuff available to you. But for whatever reason, I don't know, of these things I never could get, either I couldn't get it up and running or it wasn't nearly as seamless as the native experience. So Nuclide is worse at code completion. A lot of times in Xcode and Android Studio, I legit just type like the first 2 or 3 characters of a word, and then the environment finishes the line for me. Like, I type 2 letters and then a bunch of spacebar hits, and then all of a sudden I'm fetching my Instagram feed from the API. But what's next? Automatic imports. Right, so also I don't even have to really know the exact name of the method or class that I'm trying to bring in. I can just start typing like text or utils or something. And then a list of appropriate possibilities comes up and I select the one that I want, and the package is automatically imported for me. And when I'm not sure about the parameters of a certain function, when I'm in a native environment, I can always just hot click on the name of the function to the implementation, and then I can see how that function works. With Nuclide and React Native, I always have to search the entire workspace for the keyword that I want to figure out. And then of the search results, I have to figure out which one it is actually. So that's cumbersome. And then debugging native code is just way easier in Xcode and Android Studio. just dropping breakpoints easily and stepping through execution with buttons right in the toolbar. I know you guys have tools to do that like through the browser when you're doing web development, but that same workflow with the iOS emulator and Android emulator, it just isn't as simple and straightforward as the native debuggers, but well, finally, now that we have the cons out of the way, let's take a look at the things at which Nuclide is better. Nothing. So now let's compare how I would have accomplished some programming problem in Java versus how I ended up doing it with React and Redux. So going back to Instagram's extinct map feature, let's see what I might have done when trying to make something similar in Android. So for a screen like this, what's probably going on is there's a background service call to the API to try to fetch the logged in Instagram user's feed. And then you'll get back some sort of JSON response, and then you'll try to parse that response for individual items of media. And then you want to check to see if the coordinates would actually be visible on a map. And then for the items that are visible, you want to make them map markers. So something that might happen is you'd have this callback, this on feed received callback that gets triggered when the API response is received. And then what you would do is you would clear your Google Map object of existing map markers, and then you'd iterate through your feed, run each item through a checker function to see if it would be visible in the map region, and if it is, you would directly add a new marker object to the Google Map object with the position and the title of the Instagram piece of media. And then this process you'd also have to do, like every time the user drags the map around, you'd have to go through, run this process again. And then it becomes very apparent that it's all very imperative. You know, it's kind of a brute force process. With the React Native, I can just make the feed part of like the Redux store, right? So I can use React Native's built-in fetch API, hitting the Instagram feed URL, and then I'd get back an HTTP response of which I only want to extract the JSON body. And then with that payload, I'd dispatch a Redux action which is matched to the feed fetch success with the feed as the payload. And then that gets passed to a reducer. And all the reducer does is updates your existing feed with the new version. And then, so then the map component just recognizes the Redux store had been updated, and then it re-renders itself to the new state. So in the old way of Java, I had to manually tell the Google Map object to clear itself and when to add markers every time an API response is captured. It centers the map. But in the React world, I'm not really telling the map object anything. I just told it from the beginning to observe the Redux store, and anytime the store changes itself, it will know that it has to re-render itself with the newest immutable version of the state. And it's this part of reactive programming that I'm actually a big fan of, and changing my mindset to this reactive way of thinking has actually helped me with current client apps that I'm working on, where I've made the decision to keep going with the reactive programming. Now, other things that have to happen along the course of developing an app, component upgrades. And especially in an open source community like React Native, new versions are popping up all the time, not just with the React and with the React Native core, but with all the third-party components that you're using in your app. So if you want to get all the latest and greatest features, as well as less crashes and more stability, you want to keep all your components up to date, right? No. No, 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 no. I swear, every time I upgrade one of the major components in my app just fails to build, and then I can't rebuild it, and I can't run it, and then I have to clear my NPM cache, and then clear this cache and that cache, and then it still won't rebuild, and it never tells you why. So the problem with having to rely on all of these third-party components is that they don't care what other third-party components your app is using. As far as they know, you're just using the React Native core and then their components, and then that's it. When you have all of these dependencies stacked on top of each other, and one function gets renamed or one module is deprecated, everything just locks up. And then you either have to wait for the next version of the thing you want to upgrade, or the version of this other thing that needs to update itself so that you can go back and update the version that you originally wanted so that your whole app is then up to date with all your different versions. Okay, whatever. So yeah, where I used to look forward to up-to-date releases and versions in iOS and Android of libraries, I get legit afraid when I see that an upgrade is available. But back to the good things about React Native. So when you import and instantiate a lot of UI elements, they actually get automatically styled for you in the platform on which they're running. So here's my app, and let's say you open up the app, you've already done the OAuth authentication and you're logged in, your access token is stormed in Realm. This is the first screen you see. So this map is an Airbnb third-party component that they open sourced, which was really nice of them. And a thing about the Instagram API, when you're developing for it actively, you're actually placed in a sandbox mode. So you only get like 10 or so versions of your most recent media. So that's why otherwise you'd see a lot more thumbnails of beer and liquor in this particular area of my world map. But the map is a third-party component, and for the most part, it's the same code. There were some bits of logic where I had to detect if I was iOS or Android, but for the most part, you get an Apple Maps in the iOS environment, you get Google Maps in Google in your Android phone, and you get that without writing anything extra in the code. And all the business logic is the same, and I didn't have to take 1,000 lines of Swift and translate it to Java. You tap one of the thumbnails. This pop-up modal is also a third-party component, and it seems to do its job just fine. The sidebar navigation thing is yet another third-party component, if you're starting to see a pattern here. This is the album section of the app. Again, with React Native, all I have to do is say that I want a button at this location with this text, and then in iOS, it gets styled natively to look like a native button. And then in Android, you get the material design button, totally for free, the same exact code. It's another pop-up modal. This is what the create an album section looks like. Of course, the table view is a surprise, a third-party component. There weren't really any styling differences between iOS and Android that I had to do, but that's pretty much all the screens in the app. So yeah, that's more or less what the app looks like, apart from the OAuth login. But that's not super exciting. So now we're ready to publish the app, right? No. Now another big part of being a developer is that we like to procrastinate and push things off as much as possible. So I had been doing that. When I first signed up to give this talk, I was like, oh yeah, I'd totally have my app ready by that time, but then that did not happen. So here's a screenshot of everyone's first web page that they made in GeoCities. So that's where I'm at now. Hopefully at some point in the future you'll see that app being published, but yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
So how do you feel about the whole navigation situation in React Native?
All right.
Changed a lot. And also, is styling, I'm personally surprised that you said you got a lot of those stuff for free.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that I had to adopt React Native elements. Just want to see I spent a lot of time on it and I don't feel like I got a good
My app, from what you've seen, hopefully, is that there's not a lot of UI elements involved, really. There's just text views and buttons, and then that's it. So React Native elements really worked right out of the box for me. I don't know what your use case was, but I knew, like, going in that my app would be super simple. So that's why I chose React Native in the first place. But yeah, the navigation situation is such a mess. I think I tried all of them before. Honestly, I don't even remember which one I ended up using. Whatever one is the one recommended, pushed by Facebook, whichever one that is. Do you remember?
Navigation.
Yes, just straight navigation, right? Yeah, that one. Yeah, so it sucks. That's my word on it.